Welcome to The Common Bridge, where policy and current events are discussed in a fiercely nonpartisan manner. The host, Richard Helppie, is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and political analyst who has over 1 million listeners around the world. The Common Bridge is available on Substack.com and draws guests and audiences across the political spectrum.
Hello and welcome to The Common Bridge. We are again privileged to have with us Professor Anthony Colangelo from Southern Methodist University to talk about one of his areas of specialty, which is international law. We're recording this the day after the press conference from President Biden, where he talked extensively about the Ukraine. So let's get right into it. Professor Colangelo, thank you so much for coming to join us again on The Common Bridge.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Great. Now, when we spoke on our earlier podcast, you talked about your experience at Northwestern, Columbia, and some of the specialties that you've developed. We, of course, will have your full bio at Substack and at richardhelppie.com. But do you mind just a quick thumbnail of your professional background and what makes you qualified to have this conversation with us today?
Sure. So as I said in the prior podcast, I graduated at the top of my class from Northwestern, got a master's and PhD at Columbia, clerked on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which covers New York, Connecticut, and Vermont. Then I taught at Columbia for 2 years, and now I'm down at SMU. My areas of expertise include international law and theory, foreign relations law, and private and public international law. So including the law of war and the law of the use of nuclear weapons. I partner with the Nuclear Weapons NGO. So this is very much an area of expertise of mine. In particular, something that's fascinated me since I started working in this field is the law of military intervention. So what I thought I would do today, a little bit different than our kind of back and forth conversation that we had yesterday on abortion, would be a little bit more of an educational sort of presentation. Then we can have a dialogue on that. And as we all know, so President Putin is sort of on the verge of invading Ukraine. And just to give an example of how international law works, there are rules in place, and if you violate one of those rules, it authorizes a retaliation, more or less, from other countries to bring you back in line. Now, at this point, there is, I would say, two kind of avenues that the United States might follow, depending on the type or species of action Putin takes. If Putin comes in somewhere short of a military intervention, the U.S. may opt for a similar, what I would call a soft response, which would be something along the lines of sanctions, cyber attack, financial consequences, something like cutting off financial markets or something like that. In the more dire situation where Putin intervenes militarily, the United States would probably go for a more hard option, which would be military intervention. Now, typically countries are going to want to go for the soft option. I mean, they're a lot less expensive. You're not going to have to deal with loss of life and human suffering. I mean, I think that's something we all want to avoid. Now, what would authorize under international law the military, the hard option, the military intervention on behalf of the United States? And it's very clear under international law that military aggression violates international law. Now that is Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. The United Nations Charter prohibits aggressive war, and this actually predates the United Nations Charter. So the Nazis were prosecuted at Nuremberg for aggressive war. That was under what's called the London Charter, which laid out the crimes that the Nazis were prosecuted for. So this is a pretty long-standing prohibition, and that would trigger another article of the United Nations Charter, which is Article 51, which allows for self-defense. And one of the things that I think is particularly salient here is that, and I just want to read here, it authorizes what is called collective self-defense. So it's not self-defense just by the Ukraine, it's collective self-defense by other countries in the world. And I think this is of particular importance here because what that does is it brings into the fold the United States and possibly NATO to retaliate against Russia. And one thing that I am sort of a proponent of and have championed in my scholarship is that by waging aggressive war, the Putin would effectively be inflicting two violations of the law of international law. So let's say we have, and here we have a diagram of country A and country B. Okay. Now, one violation, let's say, just geographically, let's go geographically. So country B violates the territorial sovereignty of country A. So that's one delict, we would say. That's one wrong under international law in this specific case. But there's another violation, which would be what that does is it weakens the rule of international law, the rule of non-aggression. So we have two separate but related violations. One is the specific aggression against the Ukraine. Mm-hmm. The other is the weakening of the rule of non-aggression. And that touches on the interests of every state in the world, because every state in the world has a vested interest in the rule of non-aggression. Why is this so important? I think it's so important because the retaliation needs to deter against that. It needs to deter not only the specific violation of the Ukrainian sovereignty, but also the violation of the rule of non-aggression. And what does this mean? It goes directly to proportionality. So there's a rule of proportionality in international law. You break international law, the retaliation must be proportionate to that violation. I think that's wrong. I think if you break international law, you're not just breaking a specific law in a specific situation, you're breaking also the underlying rule of non-aggression there, right? And so I think the proportionality of the retaliation has to be somewhat larger to deter, because otherwise you wouldn't have deterrence, right? Well, you would just have. Go ahead.
Let me break in here on a couple of questions. So, first of all, one thing you didn't mention in the intro is that you've long been a member of nuclear non-proliferation, and that is something that's really kind of hallmarked your life work. That you've been working within the law to avoid war and to avoid breaches of international law. When you talk about that collective self-defense, if I understood that, that means that every country in the world would say, hey, if there's a aggression that breaches an established border, I have an interest in self-defense because I don't want somebody breaching my border.
Right.
Okay. Now, and I would imagine if this is not too many questions baked into one, China would look at Taiwan and go, we're not breaching any borders. That's always been our territory. is Putin trying to say that about the Ukraine as well?
I think he is. Yes, I think he is.
Mhm.